my 20s, I spent a fall living on a farm in northern Saskatchewan. This was not the flat prairies of the south, but the rolling hills of the Canadian Shield. You don't fly over this part of the country, let alone drive through it on the way to the Rockies. And I was taking part in a social ecology program where we were learning how to live sustainable lives in the country. We were all poor and lost in some way. A man struggling with his marriage, a single mother, 4 students not knowing what to do next, including me. I had been lonely and underemployed at a Mark's Work warehouse clearance store in Ottawa. So northern Saskatchewan seemed like a good place to go. I wanted more, and we all did. We wanted community, integrity, nature. We wanted to learn how to live better. And we came to find answers, but mostly we found root vegetables. It was very cold. We ate a lot of borscht. We picked garlic under a full moon. We stared open-mouthed and astonished at the dancing northern lights. And we found that it was hard to create community in isolation, that poverty is tough even with company, that running water indoors is a great, great gift. There was no TV, so we told each other stories when we weren't out watching the northern lights, stories from our lives, stories about our hopes and dreams. We retold the events of each day, turning them into stories. Everybody has a story. And we so often don't hear those stories that matter, the stories of not just what we did, but why we did what we did, and why we feel the way we feel. The stories that we tell to ourselves, and maybe not anyone else, shape our identity. The stories of our lives, the events both great and small, define us. The writer Isaac Dinesen said, "To be a person is to have a story to tell." When I first left northern Saskatchewan, it was with a great sense of failure. The program had imploded through a lack of leadership, the isolation and the poverty. And I told myself I was a failure, that it had been a stupid thing even to try, another dumb, poorly thought out impulsive choice. And I told myself I wasn't cut out for adventure. And I mocked the families who had shared their farms with us. And in my stories, our time became a time of comic misadventure, populated by eccentric farmers with outhouses and bad teeth. But I didn't mock my fellow participants. I could have, because we were all eccentric to one degree or another, but I did not. Out of solidarity, yes, but that solidarity arose because I knew their most intimate stories. The one woman who had had to grow up quickly because of her mother's mental illness, another who was afraid her strong principles were alienating all of her friends. And by holding each other's stories, we became, in a way, obligated. In being honest in our storytelling, we had created a sense of responsibility, a sense of care. Not that it meant we were any kinder or nicer to each other on a daily basis, but I think we were more tolerant and we forgave more easily. Knowing someone's stories builds connections between you. When you hear in their story an echo of your own, they become more real to you. We live in a society that is often superficial, obsessed with internet quizzes and Starbucks pumpkin spice lattes. And it's hard to get past that small talk of weather and the traffic. But once there is a connection, once you have really heard someone's story, it's harder to treat them like an object or a problem. It's hard not to see them like a fellow human being on this journey. The program in Saskatchewan was led by a director who had a full-time off-farm job and was hardly there. And so we didn't get to hear much of her story. Looking back, I can see she did tell it in pieces. Her sense of isolation, her deep love of the prairies, her concern, deep concern for the future. But at the time, I wasn't able to hear her story. Not properly. She was too clearly defined as part of the problem. And it's hard to hear the stories of the people we don't like so much. Think about that person who drives you crazy at work, or the relative that you wish lived out of cell phone range. Maybe they have a story you need to hear. Maybe you have a story they need to hear. Stories bring us together. They connect us at a visceral feeling level. And Matthew Fox calls stories knowledge passed through the heart. Stories, personal stories, make people real to us. And hearing a story helps us make connections in a deep and profound way. Stories can transform. Now, this isn't to suggest we should go around telling everyone everything about our lives. That would be TMI, too much information, and the introverts among us would totally freak out. And in a superficial culture, even our personal stories can be turned into a consumer item. Look at all those reality shows. Telling our stories does include a judgment call about the right time or place or person, but nor should we hide our stories. We know when we need to tell one of our stories, we get that bubbling up pressure in the chest, and it can be scary. People might not be ready to hear, especially if it's painful or tragic. And the hardest thing we can do sometimes is to tell our story. Maya Angelou says, "There is no agony like bearing an untold story inside of you. It is healing to speak, and it is healing to be heard. Stories can transform." And in this busy society, it can be hard to find a good listener. That's why we're practicing listening this month. And while it is hard to find someone to listen, when it is hard to find someone to listen, we start to forget that our lives are interesting, that we have stories worth telling, that we are fabulous people. Bombarded as we are by all the images of pretty people in the magazines, saturated in stories of car chases and hostage takings, it's not hard to feel that packing lunch for your kids lacks a little drama. But to be a person is to have a story to tell. And we need to tell our stories and shape ourselves through that telling. I took a counseling class at the seminary once in which people had the opportunity to explore their paths. I knew a few people going into this class, and I sort of saw them as sort of sweet, safe, middle-aged church ladies. And boy, was I wrong. I was astonished at the stories they shared, sometimes tragic, always surprising. Some of them were still struggling to heal. Others were moving forward with an incredible amount of grace. Some of the stories were big and dramatic, and others quietly painful or beautifully loving. And it reminded me how quickly I make assumptions about others, how easily I stick to the surface, and how wonderful we all are, what depths we have. And I will never look at a church lady the same way again. In counseling, narrative therapy helps people discern what stories are shaping their lives. And the therapists help clients find aspects of their story that they can't see clearly, aspects that might bring out a strength instead of a weakness, that might help them make a different choice, that their story begins to help them instead of hindering them. Because it's easy to tell stories that beat us down. Life can be painful and terrible. And we all at one time or another suffer from failure, from letting others down, from letting ourselves down. I can easily catalog all my limitations, from the stupid, awkward moments to the larger betrayals. And they often play in endless loops in my head. On the bad days, it takes no time at all to belittle ourselves, to tell hopeless tales, painting ourselves as the fool, the loser, the idiot. Or is that just me? When I first left northern Saskatchewan, I felt like a failure. And I lived that out for a few years, being afraid to take risks, second-guessing every decision in case it was another stupid one. But I tell a different story. The program was a failure. I was not. I was unkind and careless at times, and I handled all the conflict with little grace. But I was also funny, and I was helpful and kind most of the time. I baked a great loaf of bread. No one was hurt when the car I was driving slid on black ice and fishtailed across the highway. And I realize now that I was loved even at my weakest and worst by my companions. And I was loved in the particular, and that was a very good thing. As Barbara Brown Taylor says, who wants to be loved in general? We want to be loved for who we are, for the way we bake a loaf of bread, for the way we stand delighted under the northern lights. Northern Saskatchewan was a very long time ago, and I've lost touch with my companions. And I often find it hard to remember that I have interesting stories to tell, that I am lovable as I am, faults and gifts together. And so I come here on Sunday morning to be reminded of my inherent worth and dignity, to be reminded that my default setting is not loser, that my default setting and your default setting is fabulous. We are all whole and wholly wonderful beings with fascinating stories to tell, both the big ones and the small ones. Thomas Merton, who's a Trappist monk in the States, once wrote, "There is no way of telling people they are all walking around shining like the sun." And this really describes for me the impossible task of Unitarian Universalism. And this is what we try to say every Sunday morning through the rituals of the chalice, the words, the music, that we are all, every one of us, walking around shining like the sun. You don't believe me, of course. I don't believe me. Most of us are bleary-eyed and tired and thinking about that another cup of coffee. We're worried about paying off that MasterCard bill. We're concerned that our kids might not be okay. A little lunch soon would be nice. No shining here. And we make the mistake of assuming shining and needing lunch are mutually exclusive. That we have to be good and kind to shine better than we are. But the universe is made up of atoms and stories woven together. Our lives are the mundane of the tea and the beauty of the story woven together. And sometimes it's the beauty of the coffee and the mundane story, for we are fabulous in the particular, not the general. You may not believe me. I may not believe me. There is no way of telling people they are all walking around shining like the sun. All we can do is listen. Listen to other people's stories about how they leave tracks like a penguin on the beach, or why the northern lights make them homesick for a Saskatchewan farm. So listen well and shine on. So say we all.